Welcome everyone for our web conference today, a conversation with the authors of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus. Prevent Connect is a national project of Valor US, formerly known as the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or Valor. I almost said CalCASA. Okay, I am actually going to turn this over to Tori, because Tori is going to get this conversation started and introduce you to our guest today. So Tori, it is all yours.
Thanks, Ashley. So when folks registered for this session, you may have seen that we have a handful of objectives for our time together today. We want you all to be able to describe the key findings of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus. We also hope that you'll identify opportunities to create campus environments that protect against sexual and dating violence. And finally, we hope that you discuss implications for shifting campus sexual and dating violence prevention to the community level. And before we begin, it's really important for us to note that our discussion of Sexual Citizens will contain descriptions of actual sexual assaults as students have experienced them. This material can be hard to listen to, and we know that in every room, virtual, in person, wherever, there are survivors. So we are going to put the RAINN hotline in the chat should folks feel like they need to use that resource now or later. So that will be in the chat for the rest of the session, and feel free to write that down as we are introducing our next polling question. So as Ashley had said, and from the podcast we had done with Jennifer and Seamus, Sexual Citizens has been around for over a year now, and since it's been a COVID year, it's felt like it's been around for 5 years. So we want to hear from you all. How familiar are you with Sexual Citizens? I know I saw folks in the chat saying that they have book clubs, they've written theses on it. I feel like that's something that would qualify as very familiar with the work of Sexual Citizens. But I see folks are responding right now. Thank you for folks who are responding to that poll question. And about half of folks, they're not very familiar with Sexual Citizens. This is their kind of first event, first exposure, first knowledge. And then we've got about 30% of folks have attended some other talks about it. Jennifer and Seamus, I know I've seen your names on a lot of podcasts and other web conference invites before. So I think some folks have attended that before. And then we've got about 15% of folks who are very familiar. So I imagine those are our book club folks, our thesis folks, and some others too. So thank you all so much for participating. I'm going to end that poll now. And now I am just super honored to introduce you all to Jennifer and Seamus. Jennifer Hirsch is a professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. Seamus Khan is a professor of sociology and American studies at Princeton University. Together, they are the co-authors of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, published by W.W. Norton, and we'll provide a link in the chat where you can learn more about Sexual Citizens on their website. That work was realized as part of Columbia's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, co-directed by Jennifer and clinical psychologist Claude Ann Mellons, which was profiled in The New Yorker in February of 2018. A recent review in Science describes Sexual Citizens as profoundly eye-opening, and I absolutely agree. So we are so honored to have you both here on a web conference and back with Prevent Connect. To start off, can you tell us about the SHIFT study and why you decided to write Sexual Citizens?
Well, Tori, the honor is really ours. We're so happy to be with all of you. We love all of it's like next level Zooming here, all the interactive stuff. So you've got a strong Zoom game 18 months into the pandemic. So I'm going to start to bring in, particularly those of you who are not familiar with the book, start with the story, because the book is very narrative driven and grounded in students, the stories of their experiences in college. So when Lucy arrived on campus, she'd gone to a pretty sheltered boarding school, and she had a clear idea of what she was hoping would happen in the first couple months of school socially. She wanted to meet some boys, to make out, and eventually lose her virginity. And so it felt on track when a girl on her hall, and we refer to them as girls because that's how they're referred to on campus, a girl on her hall, Nancy, asked if she wanted to go out to a bar in the neighborhood during that first week on campus before classes started. So they went out. They were not 21, but probably not everyone in the audience will be shocked to know that you can get into a bar with a pretty bad fake ID if you're a pretty girl or in a college neighborhood. And they met some seniors there, which felt very exciting. Scott asked Lucy to dance. They shared some drinks. He asked her if she wanted to go back to the fraternity, and she said yes. And so they walked up Amsterdam Avenue in the warm summer night. And this was a moment, it felt like right on track with her dream of her first week in college. Her phone was ringing, and Scott was like really trying to go back to the fraternity, but she stopped to see who it was. It turned out it was Nancy, who had gotten a bystander intervention in those first days of school and was checking up to make sure that Lucy was okay. And so they waited for Nancy outside the fraternity, and then they went inside. Scott asked the girls if they'd like another drink. They said yes. Fraternities are not allowed to serve hard alcohol, but doesn't mean they don't do it. It just means that they keep it upstairs. And so they went up to the second floor. So like pause to imagine the scene for a moment. Two young women in a building they've never been in before on a campus where they literally just arrived. And sort of the prime directive during that week for first year students is to not do anything that feels stupid. So they're trying to like go along and have this college experience. Scott is in a building that he lives in where he is surrounded by his friends on a campus where he's been for 3 years and where he has accumulated pretty substantial experience with drinking and sex. Nancy passed out almost immediately after sipping her drink, and Scott asked Lucy if she wanted to go up to his room, and she did. So they went up to his room on the 3rd floor, and they were making out, and it was all good until he started to unbutton her pants, and she was taken aback. She was a virgin, and she said to him very clearly, "No, don't," to which he replied, "It's okay." But as you can probably guess, it wasn't okay. And when she told us that story several years later, she had never described it to anyone as a rape. She described it to her roommate the next day as like one of those crazy things that happens during orientation week when you lose your virginity to a total stranger, because as you all will know is not uncommon, she felt like she should have known better. She felt like it was her fault. And, you know, that's a hard story. In some ways, it might sound like a very sort of stereotypical story, but the way it lands with you all, your take might be, Scott, a terrible person. We have to find people like that and get them off our campuses. And it's not entirely a bad take. Scott did a terrible thing. And yet we wrote Sexual Citizens, and we started the work back in 2014 that Sexual Citizens shares to change the conversation away from a focus on bad people and to expand out towards what could have been done to keep that thing from happening. What kind of world do we need to build so that when Lucy says, "No, don't," Scott says, "Okay, I won't." So, you know, when we started in 2014 with the work, the focus was very much on thinking about campuses as like a hunting ground and on improving systems of adjudication. And that's certainly a very important project. But again, we back up and say, yes, fine to improve, fine, in fact, good to improve systems of adjudication, but let's do the work. Let's identify how sexual assault is actually built into campus environments. And then let's have a bigger conversation, a more ambitious one, about what would be required, not just of campuses, but of all of us to build it out.
thank you for giving us some of that context and background about how this all came to be. I remember being on a campus when Hunting Ground came out and how that was such a huge part of the conversation. And I really appreciate that this work takes that momentum and that conversation and shifts towards prevention. So spoiler alert, Ashley and I have read the book cover to cover. And this book is centered around 3 big ideas: sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. These are the lens through which you make sense of sexual assault in this book. So can you share how these ideas interact with one another?
Absolutely. And like Jennifer, I'm going to start with a story, and it's the story of Charisma. Charisma described Columbia and Barnard campuses, where we did the research, as white spaces. And when we asked her what she meant, she said, well, it's filled with white guys who drink too much, listen to shitty music, can't dance, and don't find me attractive. Now, obviously, Charisma didn't find these guys attractive either. And so in order to find a sexual partner, she was talking with her roommate, who was from New York, who set her up with a guy who lived out in Brooklyn. And for a couple of weeks, Charisma and this guy texted back and forth. And finally, she decided, this Saturday night, I'm going to go out and meet him. And it was one of those disastrous evenings for New York City sort of public transit. You can get these weekends where it takes forever. Brooklyn's only 10 miles away from, or where she was going in Brooklyn, less than 10 miles away from Upper Manhattan where she was, but it took her almost 2 hours and she was soaking wet. And when she got to his apartment, she peeled off her clothes, had a drink with him, smoked a bit of a joint, and they started to make out. And everything was fine until he started to put his hands on her body. And she wasn't ready for that. She moved them away, and then he put them right back. And she said to us, I never really had a plan B. My plan A was body language, and it had always worked before. Charisma then described an assault that she experienced in his apartment, one where she clearly said no to him at one point in time. And she reasoned that it wasn't really an assault because he must have thought she was uncomfortable. He repositioned them at the time. Now, like the story that Jennifer told, you can listen to Charisma's story and think, what an awful guy. Maybe he's a predator. And that might be part of the story. But what Jennifer and I want to do is point to, as she said, prevention. And it's pretty hard to prevent sociopathic predators from doing what they're going to do. It's, however, our position within sexual citizenship that a lot of sexual assaults, not all of them, but a lot of them aren't that. And we use the ideas of sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies to try and figure out a different way of thinking about this and thinking about prevention. So sexual projects emerges out of Jennifer's earlier work, and it's the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you might think like only 2 pointy-headed academics could ask a question like, what is sex for? But if you ask yourself that question, it actually isn't so clear what it's for. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that within this country, we don't really talk to each other or to young people in particular about what sex is for. The second reason is that sex is for lots of things. It's not for one thing. For some people, it's for reproduction, but most sex, it isn't for that at all. For some people, it's pleasure, but we know that a lot of sex isn't actually that pleasurable. There's a huge gender gap in what's referred to as the orgasm gap. Sex can be about our status. If you think about the concept of a league, what league are you in? Or is somebody outside of your league? Sex captures that idea of status. It can be about having new experiences. For LGBTQ people, it was about coming to define yourself. We propose in Sexual Citizens that we can't understand why a lot of assaults happen without understanding what people are trying to do with their sexual lives. Because many assaults emerge out of consensual sexual situations. That is, they are consensual until they're not. The story of Lucy is exactly this. The section concept that we draw upon is Sexual Citizens. And where Jennifer and I are not particularly judgy about sexual projects, we'll argue that some sexual projects, it's not like hooking up causes harm inherently, because we point to how being in a relationship can expose you to intimate partner violence. But where we do have a kind of moral language for sexuality is when it comes to sexual citizenship. Sexual citizenship is the idea that we all have the right to sexual self-determination. That means that we have the right to say yes to sex and the right to say no to sex. And this is a bit of a provocation because frequently for many groups of young people in the United States, LGBTQ people, but women to a degree, and many others, their right to sexual self-determination is frequently undermined by communities and institutions. But sexual citizenship isn't just about rights, it's also about obligations. And we argue that fully formed sexual citizens are people who don't just have a clear sense of their own right to sexual self-determination, they also have a sense of their obligation to recognize the equivalent rights in others. So in Charisma's story, the story that we tell is part of a long arc of experience that she has where she comes to discover what her sexual project is through trial and error. And we see that profoundly as a failure of the communities that raised her and the community that she was in at the time. The young man's sexual project was to get off. We didn't really talk to him, so we're kind of assuming that, but it seems kind of clear from the story that she tells us. And that young man had a deeply impoverished sense of sexual citizenship, where he had a clear sense of his own right to sexual self-determination, to have the kind of sex he wanted to have. He did not see Charisma as an equivalent person. In the Scott and Lucy story, when Lucy says, no, don't, and Scott says, it's okay, he is in effect denying her sexual citizenship. The final concept is sexual geographies. And in some ways, this is the most powerful concept, we think, for making sense of interventions. In the story that we tell with Charisma, she's out in Brooklyn, and we don't mean to say that Brooklyn is a dangerous place, but we noted that frequently, more powerful people had control over the space where sex was happening. Scott had control of the room that he was in with Lucy, in a fraternity where he was surrounded by his friends. Charisma was out in this guy's apartment. When I opened by saying Charisma described Columbia as a white space, it wasn't just for kind of effect to pull you into the story. It was also to highlight how there were certain aspects of the space of Columbia's campus life that drove her away from campus. The fact that white men, heterosexual men, controlled the high-value social spaces where younger students tended to socialize didn't provide space for Charisma on campus. In this sense, the whiteness of campus is a critical feature of its geography and a critical feature of its power inequalities. Finally, Charisma wasn't from a wealthy family. She couldn't just open up her phone, open an app, and get a ride hailing or open an Uber and basically say, come take me back to Columbia. That was a $50 to $60 car ride she didn't have the money for. And so another aspect of spatial geographies is this idea of intersecting forms of power and inequality, where the control over space, which is tied to masculinity, the fact that Columbia was a white space, which was tied to race, or that class dimension of being unable to leave as easily, all together produced the kind of experience that Charisma had. And so through the story, we can see how it may be a perfectly reasonable read to think about that guy as a bad individual. But what we want to do is open up our understanding to think about the projects that we're trying to achieve when having sex, the concept of moral citizenship, of our obligation to recognize the rights of others, and our requirement as communities to develop a sense of sexual self-determination in young people, and then how geography may be a critical lever where we can look at power and how power works on campus and potentially change it in order to make sexual assault less likely to happen.
I really appreciate you sharing Charisma's story as it relates to these three concepts and giving folks a great comprehensive overview of what these three concepts mean. Because when I first read the book, I remember being like, okay, so this one falls under that category and this one under that one. But I think that all three of them together, sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies, really not only provides a great roadmap of a way to analyze how sex and sexual assault happen, but on the flip side, also are a great roadmap for how to analyze where are we having impact with our prevention. And so, Ashley, I think we have a question for the audience coming up. Did you want to announce that for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just kind of jotting down my own notes. So Jennifer Seamus, if I like totally got those wrong, please let me know. But they were helpful to me, so I wanted to just pop them in there. But we would love to hear from you all. When you're thinking about these concepts, how can you incorporate sexual citizenship, sexual geographies, and sexual projects into your prevention work? What are your thoughts on that? Some folks we've already heard from, you're already working really closely with these concepts, and so we'd love to hear what that looks like on your campus. For those of you who are maybe just hearing about these concepts right now, what are some initial thoughts or insights that you have? Feel free to answer that in the chat. We'll circle back and see what folks are saying in a few minutes, Tori, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course. I'll ask my next question to Jennifer and Seamus, and then we'll read some responses from the chat. But you know, when I think about incorporating these concepts into sexual violence prevention work, the one that kind of sticks out to me the most is the concept of sexual geographies and how much the spaces we create and the spaces that, you know, young people, folks on campus do or do not have access to can directly impact their sexual encounter. I think there was a part of the book where you described dorm rooms too, and how, you know, the bed becomes everything. It becomes a sexual space, a sleeping space, a study space, an eating space, a socializing space. It's all of it in a dorm room setting. So can you build on your idea of sexual geographies and talk more about why you think space matters so much and how that provides critical opportunities for prevention too? And for folks in our audience, as Jennifer and Seamus are answering this question, we're going to be sharing slides of previous Prevent Connect web conferences that also discuss place and prevention.
Right, because we're certainly not the first people to have this insight that one way of that is important to think about the actual physical environment. I would say that there's three sort of key bullet points in thinking about sexual geographies in relation to sex and campus sexual assault. The first is that space shapes sexual interactions and sexual assault. The second is that space is a way of seeing power in the campus environment. And the third is that space is a way potentially of modifying those power inequalities. So if you think about the moment when the parties shut down and the bars close, students are funneled back into those rooms that Tori described that mostly have 4 pieces of furniture, a bed, a desk, a dresser, and a desk chair. And you can't both sit on the desk chair, and people end up sitting on the bed, and beds have sexual meanings. And it's our job in public health to think about how to build environments where it's easier for people to act in ways where they don't get hurt and they don't hurt other people. And so rather than think, okay, let's try to reshape the interaction between those 2 people on the bed, a totally different way of approaching the problem is let's give them spaces to be other than the bed. So we had this like super exciting moment in our ongoing conversations with the Columbia administrators when the vice president of housing and dining began to see himself as a sexual assault prevention stakeholder. He heard what we were saying, and it wasn't only because of our research findings, but it was in part because of them. And he was like, oh, you know, you could see the light bulb go off. And he said, that's something I can actually do something about. And so he decided to keep one of the dining halls open all night on Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays so that students would have someplace else to go. And it wasn't like the big clattery dining hall. It was the dining hall that has like pool tables and, you know, nice chairs to sit in. It was a place that you could hang out with somebody over a plate of French fries and get to know them better. And our point is not that French fries are going to prevent every assault, but that this is one direction that we can think in terms of reimagining the campus context. So that's sort of like point number 1. Point number 2 is about space and power. If you think back to the Lucy N. Scott story or the Charisma story, both of those show ways that the organization of residential and social space on campus as it is currently amplifies power inequalities, whether those are racial power inequalities or gender power inequalities or inequalities between first-year students who are so vulnerable and fourth-year students who have so much more experience. And so part of what's exciting about sexual geographies as an idea, like, I don't know about you all, but Seamus and I, there's not going to be a day that we wake up and like end gender inequality or end all of the oppression of queer people or end racial inequality. Like every day we try to do our part, but those are big things to fix in any one policy. And so thinking about how we can modify campus sexual geographies so that they mitigate those power inequalities rather than amplify them, that is like a real concrete way that you can think about leveling the playing field on your campus. If you're working on a campus or if you're working in a community, think about who has access to spaces. So think about the choices that institutions make with housing space. It's sort of taken for granted that first year students should have worse rooms. So that means they have less privacy and they have less space to host parties. So in our ideal world, there would be more space to host parties for first year students and women students and students of color and queer students, any student, first generation student, any student with a minoritized identity that is less likely to be in a place like Scott, less likely to be the person who like owns the fraternity house. Let's see what we can do, not to shut down the fraternities, that's a whole other conversation, but instead to create alternative spaces that can, where students of minoritized groups can choose the music, decide what beverages are on offer, and sort of control the social environment. So sexual geographies we see as a really powerful route to community level prevention. And in fact, we're developing a toolkit, which we're going to call the Sexual Assault Prevention and Campus Equity Toolkit, or SPACE Toolkit, because we're really leaning into those great acronyms, that will be a sort of guide to campuses assessing, reimagining, and transforming a social and residential space on campus. So there's the sign up link for it. It's very early development stages yet. So maybe next fall it'll be available and free. We're not selling anything. We're developing resources for people to use so that the book can have impact.
That's so great to hear that there is an upcoming toolkit for this, because I feel like the conversations in the chat, folks are really excited about. They're excited about sexual projects and sexual citizenship, but I feel like there's a real hunger for more information about this concept around sexual geographies. Ashley, can you let us know, I know it was quite a busy chat, what are some things that were coming up in response to our question about how folks can incorporate sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies in their prevention work?
Yes, absolutely. I've been loving this conversation. So there was a couple comments around sex ed. So I think it was Chelsea that said, sex education has to be holistic. It's not just about like STIs and probably the things that lots of us learned about in sex ed, but why aren't we talking about healthy relationships, consent, how to be a sexual citizen? And Kate said something similar about currently integrating comprehensive sex education into prevention in order to give students opportunities to think about their sexual projects. Why? What is the why? I also loved a comment from Ray about leading from approaches centered around anti-racism and anti-oppression, which really adds, I think, important context to all three concepts. Brianne raised an interesting point that at their campus, there's no place where students are quote unquote allowed to have sex. So if that's like off the table, how then do you create safe spaces for sexual interactions? And then Angela, and there's still more coming in, so I'll have to go back and see what's happening. But I really appreciated Angela taking these three concepts and mapping them across the social ecological model, which so many of us use when we're thinking about our prevention work, and said that, sexual projects makes Angela think about the individual, the relationship level. Geographies is really pointing to community level work and strategies like creating protective environments. And then citizenship relates to social norms. So I will continue to mine the chat, Tori, but I wanted to lift those up for Jennifer and Seamus.
That's great. And I'm really excited that comprehensive sex ed was something that folks were bringing up in that last text chat question, because I know that in the book, Jennifer and Seamus, you discuss how sex education is necessary for preventing sexual assaults. Can you talk a little bit more about what you learned about the importance of sex education in your study?
Absolutely. You know, when we talked to students, and just to take one little step back, you know, the research that we're talking about, there are multiple interwoven studies. The Sexual Citizens draws upon the qualitative portion of SHIFT, which Jennifer co-led with Claudine Mellons. And in that qualitative portion, we interviewed 151 students for about 2 hours. 25 of them, we did up to 2 rounds of follow-up interviews, so spending about 6 hours with them. We also ran focus groups, and then we had researchers embedded in campus life. So 4 people who were always public about who they were and what they were doing at fraternity and sorority events, but not just there, on intramural sports teams, in religious student organizations with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish student organizations. They were hanging out with students who, by their own admission, didn't really do much, playing Catan on a Saturday night. Jennifer and I went to public events and to sort of see what campus life was like. So when we spoke to those students, and when we observed them, one of the things that they said about sex ed was like, they kind of laughed and they said, "Oh, you mean my sexual diseases course?" And they talked about how sex ed was basically an education in all the terrible things that would happen to you if you had sex. It was about STIs, it was about unwanted pregnancy, and, you know, the kind of almost comical carrying around a 5-pound bag of flour and how burdensome that would be. Sex ed was about the problems of sex. And there wasn't really a positive accounting of what sex was for, how it would fit into people's lives, and how other moral lessons that young people had had would connect to sex. It wasn't just, though, that sex ed was often about all the terrible things that would happen if you had sex. Sex ed was also really unequally distributed. And we saw this in 2 critical ways. The first was really a class dynamic, where students from poorer school districts and from poorer states had much less access to comprehensive age-appropriate sexuality education. This wasn't just a kind of politics story, it was also a resources story. The second thing that we saw was that many LGBTQIA students were fundamentally erased by their sex ed. So every single queer student that we spoke to, when we asked them about sex ed, they told us it wasn't applicable to them. By which they didn't mean like, oh, I don't have sex and I'm never going to. They meant that the sex ed that they had gotten never spoke to their experience. And this is like part of a policy design. This isn't just part of like a casual implication of a minoritized population and not really getting a lot of space. There are several states in the United States that actually mandate that if sex ed is provided, it has to be homophobic. It cannot mention in any positive way anything other than heterosexual sex. Now, the consequences of this are really profound. One of the consequences that we saw comes from the quantitative portion of the study. So where Sexual Citizens draws primarily on the qualitative portion, we've also published a series of papers as part of a broader research group led by Claudine Mellons in a quantitative portion of the study. There were many studies that we did in that, or 2 studies, but I just want to focus on one of them, which was a random population survey of the student body at Columbia and Barnard. So we surveyed 2,500 students and we had a 66% response rate, which for those of you who've tried to do student surveys before is really kind of astonishing, especially for a sexual experiences survey. And in that, we asked a range of sort of comprehensive questions about people's life experiences, sexual experiences, experiences with unwanted sex, and all kinds of other things, sort of testing a lot of the things in the literature. What we found was really consistent with what a lot of the other literature had found, which is important because it helped us see that like Columbia and Barnard weren't a huge outlier in a lot of these things. But in a really critical paper, where the first author was Jennifer's husband, John Santelli. I feel like we have to give some love to John. One of the things that we found within that paper that John and I'm a distant co-author of that paper, was that for women who had had sex ed that included practicing refusal skills, that is, practicing saying no to sex they didn't want to have, those women were half as likely to be raped in college. That bears repeating because in the social sciences, we don't really get effect sizes that large. But when we were first developing plans for the COVID vaccine and figuring out like what would an effective vaccine look like, the standard that was set by the CDC was 50% effectiveness. So if we had something that provided 50% effectiveness for something like sexual assault, it would be hugely powerful. And what that paper suggests is that we do actually have it. We just refuse to use it. Now, I want to have a word of caution, not about the paper, which I think is very scientifically sound, and I think Jennifer will probably throw a link to it into the chat. It's not behind a paywall. It's part of a big science journal that anyone can have access to. You know, training women to say no to sex they don't want to have is only one part of what sex ed can do. It can also, and critically, teach people how to listen. In that Scott and Lucy story, it's not just about Lucy learning to say no better. It's about Scott hearing Lucy and recognizing what it is that she's saying. And so for us, we think about sex ed as prevention. It is fundamental to any prevention effort that we are going to do, and it has to come early. One of the things that we also found in that broader survey was that one of the strongest predictors for being assaulted in college was being assaulted in high school. We need to get to young people earlier. Think for a moment, we're really fond in our work of driving analogies throughout the whole book. So if you've read the book, you're going to see a lot of driving analogies. But think about the amount of effort that goes into making sure that young people can successfully move 2-ton vehicles about the world without harming one another. Well, we have graduated license laws saying that like you can't really drive until you know really how to drive. We're not suggesting that we have graduated sex laws, but it's part of what we do. We also insist on comprehensive training with systematic education that young people have to go through. But we don't just trust young people to act in the way that we want them to act. We do lots of things to protect them. What does that mean? It means creating safer cars. It means mandating the use of seatbelts. It means really creating a moral pressure not to do things like drink and drive or drive when inebriated. It means creating social roles like the designated driver, which is a desirable role that you can play by not drinking and helping protect other people. It means looking at roads and saying, wow, you know what we need? We need crews of people to look to see where the stop signs have been obscured by trees and then have people trim those trees back so that the stop signs are visible. We need to make sure that sidewalks have curb cuts so that pedestrians are safer and aren't hit by drivers. Think about all of the effort that we have gone into to drastically reduce driving deaths in the United States. And we have drastically reduced them since the 70s. What would an equivalent effort look like when it comes to sex? What would it look like to have people, us as a community, collectively commit to something equivalent? Whereas today, what we effectively do is hand the keys to kids and say, wow, I hope you figure out how to do this while you're kind of drunk and a little bit anxious. Like, that is not a strategy for how to lead people into successful lives. And we take this as kind of then a population level strategy, where it's everyone's job to do something like this. And we need to remind ourselves that sex ed, while contentious, has bipartisan support. There's a lot of evidence for this. Parents really want sex ed. There are a lot of vocal parents who say they don't want it, but overall, parents really want sex ed, in part because they don't really want to talk to their kids about sex, which we'll argue in a little bit is kind of a problem. But still, thinking about a multi-sectoral approach where sex ed is at the center of our prevention efforts is really important.
I love when you all share that driving analogy. I feel like it connects so much in the ways that we think about prevention on the individual and relationship level, prevention on the community level, prevention on the societal level, and just kind of opens the door for more opportunities and a different kind of framing to think about sex ed. And you're getting some great support in the chat for that analogy too. So there's another part of the book where, and this I put the book down and had to, like, you know, take 15 minutes, go get a cup of coffee after that, because it was really powerful to read about, and something that I hadn't ever read about before. You tell the story of a young man who realizes, as he's talking to you in that moment, that he had previously committed an assault. Along with the need for sex education, the story and others in the book highlight the need for conversations about restorative and transformative justice. I think this also takes into consideration what a lot of folks in our audience have heard recently in the past, you know, year or longer, about calls to defund and abolish the police that are gaining mainstream attention. So can you speak more to these ideas and how we as a society should consider shaping sexual citizenship with a new set of values?
Yeah, I mean, I think Austin's story really lifts up that this is not a problem that we can punish our way out of. Austin, as you know, Tori, is one of the more engaging characters in the book. There's the only really spicy sex scene in Sexual Citizens features Austin doing his part to narrow the campus orgasm gap. He was really committed to being both a good boyfriend and a good lover. And he and his girlfriend had actually developed nicknames for the different kinds of orgasms that she had. And so it was hard for him to put that together with a story he told us when we interviewed him. We asked students to describe both a good sexual experience and a bad sexual experience. And he started telling the story by saying, well, that it was something weird that happened. The first week of campus, he was sexiled, as the kids say, off into someone else's room so that Austin's roommate could be alone with the roommates, essentially with the girl he was hooking up with. And when he went into that room, that girl's roommate was asleep in her bed, and she lifted up her head and mumbled something about how she didn't really want to do anything because she was drunk, which is weird. Like, why should you have to assert a sexual boundary when someone comes into your room? Think about the sexual geographies there. But so he didn't listen to her. Instead, he got in bed and started to touch her body. And then he stopped himself. And so as he recounted this story to us in the interview, and you know, a little bit uncomfortably maybe. And then later in the interview, we asked him, well, do you know what a sexual assault is? And he said, you know, yeah. I mean, everyone at Columbia and Barnard knows, right? They've all gotten the training. He said it's, you know, any kind of non-consensual sexual anything. And then he paused and his eyes welled up and he said, if you'll excuse me, fuck me. Like, he couldn't believe, given the person that he had grown into being, that was something that he had done. And so that is not a situation where, like, certainly we're not opposed to people being held responsible and learning to do better. But the problem is that there's no feedback loop. There's no way, like, he and that girl actually had many subsequent conversations, but he doesn't even know if she remembered it. She never said anything to him about it. The burden shouldn't necessarily be on people who are harmed to teach people who harmed them to do better. But because so few assaults are reported, the current system of adjudication that we have is not going to lead us towards a better world. I mean, in fact, when students are held responsible, and then they're expelled, that just puts them in school somewhere else. It doesn't teach them really anything about how to do better. Or, you know, we think about the story of Adam, who came from a conservative Midwestern family. He wasn't out to them. He was so excited to get to New York because he felt like it was going to be paradise for a young gay man. And then it kind of wasn't paradise, because he would meet guys on Grindr and they'd hook up, and then the guys would ghost him. And he wanted to have sex in the context of a committed relationship. And so he was really happy to have found a boyfriend, except as he described his sexual relationship with his boyfriend, he described his boyfriend as sort of forceful about sex, and then went on to recount one particular instance in which his boyfriend had come back to their room drunk and, in Adam's words, basically raped him. So again, like Adam was, there's not something that Adam even remotely wanted to report. He didn't even want to label it. He didn't want to confront his boyfriend because he didn't have the words for it. He didn't want to tell any of his friends because he didn't want them to hate his boyfriend because he loved his boyfriend. So we've sort of, by creating a system where the only path forward is confrontation, there's a really powerful disincentive for people to report, because mostly the people who assault them are people they know, frequently people they care about, frequently people in their social world. So, and there's so many stories in the book of people who assault other people without knowing that what they're doing is assault. So we go back to the driving metaphor, right? Like we are responsible, all of us, because we should be doing more to teach people how to have sex without hurting other people. So similar to the calls, this is now I'm actually going to get to wind up with the question you asked. The whole point of defund the police is that we're not going to get to a less violent world through policing. We have to invest in our communities and invest in positive human development and build communities where people can thrive. And similarly, we're not going to get to campuses through less sexual assault, with less sexual assault, by trying to crack down on assaulters, because mostly assaulters aren't reported. And so we really need to back up and think about prevention. If you think about our disastrous, we can't even say experiment because it was sort of deliberate racial inequality, the disastrous American experience with mass incarceration, you can see that like punishment doesn't work as prevention. There's a lot of evidence behind that. And so if we want prevention, we have to, no shocker, like actually do prevention.
Thank you for sharing those stories and sharing how they relate back to prevention. I think of the example that I often hear is like, you can't just like push everyone who's caused harm or perpetrated violence onto an island. And there are opportunities for prevention and education within that. And I think so much of like the what frequently happens is that if someone has been found in violation of Title IX at one campus, then it becomes not that campus's problem, but the next campus's problem, or the next community's problem, or employer's problem, where we could have also had an opportunity for prevention and education to prevent further harm from occurring. Ashley, I know there's a lot of conversation happening in the chat, and I'm so excited about it. I do want to let folks know that we will make a transcript of that available, as well as the links shared, because there's so much great resource sharing going on. But I think we have one more question for our audience.
Yeah, Tori, and it really is a great conversation happening. As Tori said, we'll make the transcripts available. We'll take out identifying information, so won't use your names. But we'd love to know, how else do you see alternatives to criminalization and punishment and prevention intersecting? What are your thoughts there? We'll give people a few minutes to kind of think on this and share, Tori. And if you don't mind coming back to me in a couple minutes, I will report out.
Yeah, of course. It's a big question to think about. So I'm really excited to see the responses come in from our audience. So one of the other things that what really struck me reading this book is how you talk about the role of power in sexual assault. Can you speak to what you were able to reveal about the way that race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other social identities can influence the likelihood of sexual assault?
Absolutely. Jennifer and I are really building on decades and generations of really important research in sexual assault. And if you read the book, you'll see The book looks a lot longer than it is, in part because it's got 40 plus pages of footnotes. Don't worry, when you read it, you're not constantly running through footnotes. But the aim is, to build on what we already know and to try and put it together in a new kind of perspective, as well as to tell sort of some new things. And the classic approach and understanding of sexual assault is in relationship between gender and power. Sometimes we even describe it as gender-based violence. And we don't think that that's wrong, but we think that it's insufficient for sort of two reasons. Some reason today I'm dealing in twos in my answers. But the first is that recent intellectual developments think about gender in an intersectional way, which is to say that we can't fully understand gender dynamics without understanding how it intersects with things like race or class or ability or sexuality. And so we want to bring that intersectional framework to the analysis. The second, and deeply related to this, is that gender is not the only form of power on campus. And if we think of sexual assault as being in part explained by power inequalities, then we need to think about the ways that power and assault are deeply intertwined in multiple different ways. So let me give you a few examples of this. When we spoke to people, it was very notable when Jennifer and I kind of stepped back to start doing our analysis. I would say even shocking to us. It might have been one of the more shocking moments that every single Black woman that we spoke to told us a story of unwanted sexualized touching. I'll just repeat that, every single one. And they often told it to us in such a nonchalant way that they didn't even classify it or talk about it as unwanted sexualized touching. It was just sort of layered onto another indignity that they were experiencing. Now, Jennifer and I argue that we can't understand that experience through gender alone, because it's not just an experience of gender, it's an experience of racism. It's about the systematic devaluing of Black women's bodily autonomy and how that gets expressed by very liberal Columbia students. And so we have to think about why that happens. Also want to tell here the story of Carl. Carl, like many of the men that we spoke to, was really concerned about false accusations. So many men talked to us about how worried they were that they would be falsely accused, a fear that far outstripped the actual risk of being falsely accused. But Carl's story was even more notable because Carl was a Black man, and he talked about how he was not willing to have drunk sex, particularly with white women. And it didn't mean that he wasn't willing to be drunk and have sex. It also meant that he wasn't willing to have sex with women who had been drinking. And he met a woman at a party and he assessed, they were flirting and everything, she really, in his view, really wanted to hook up with him and he was really into her, but he assessed that she was sort of too drunk. And so when they left the party, he insisted that they walk around campus for nearly 2-3 hours, up until the very beginning of the morning, until he thought, okay, maybe we can have sex. And then they went back to his room and he still insisted upon waiting a very long time. Now you may think this is great. We actually think it's great, right? It's wonderful for someone to wait until the other person sobers up. Carl then said, that they hooked up, they had sex. And then as she was leaving, he recorded her saying what a great time that she'd had. And as he recorded her, he recounted to us that he had done his research. He knew that New York was a one-party consent state, which meant that if he were brought before a court, his recording would be admissible in his defense, even though she hadn't agreed to be recorded. That's kind of an astonishing thing if you think about it. And it speaks to how Carl's experience of sex is very much tied up with what it means to be a Black man in America and what it means to be a Black man in America for Carl, where the fear of being brought before a court system was one where he was likely to be the subject of profound injustice. Now, it's not just race and the Black women and the story of Carl, but we also saw this with queerness. So Jennifer told the story of Adam earlier, and another story is that of Maddie. Maddie was born male at birth, but was transitioning and identified as a woman. as Maddie was going through this transition, she was in a relationship with another woman. And, she was pretty happy with the relationship until, in her experience, her partner kept pressuring her to have sex with her penis. And like Maddie didn't want to have sex with her penis because she found it profoundly invalidating. She found it to be something that was like erasing the person who she was. And yet Maddie said it was a war of attrition. She just wore me down. And one of the ways that Maddie was worn down was by her partner, who was also, her partner was genderqueer, saying to Maddie, "You don't think I'm beautiful." And that phrase, "you don't think I'm beautiful," was something that for Maddie, it was sort of, it cut really deep, because Maddie knew what it felt like to be someone who wasn't sort of a cisgendered person who was thought of as traditionally beautiful. And as Maddie said, her wants overtook my needs. Now, when we hear that story, or we hear Adam's story, it goes back to what I said earlier when talking about sexual projects. Like, both Maddie and Adam were in relationships. They had sexual projects committed to relationships, and it didn't protect them from harm. In fact, they were exposed to harm for a different reason. And the exposure to harm that both Maddie and Adam experienced were in part because of their queerness. LGBTQIA students at Columbia's campus had some of the very highest rates of assault of any population. And that's consistent with a lot of other studies. Now, if we just think about toxic masculinity as the driver of assault, we can't really explain why it is that those queer people have those experiences. Yes, some of the experiences are about harassment from cis hetero men, but most of them were not. Most of them are from within that community. Maddie's experience of being worn down, of being forced to use her penis during sex, was one where she assessed basically that she'd rather have non-consensual sex than reject her partner's sense of her own beauty and say, "No, you're actually not beautiful." Like, that was an act in our analysis of queer solidarity. And it's impossible to make sense of that without thinking about the ways that culturally and structurally and institutionally queerness gets invalidated, erased, and viewed as a problem. And so we have put Maddie in that kind of situation. The big lesson here is that we need to think about intersecting forms of power, and we need to see how equity, broadly conceived, gender equity for certain, because we cannot lose sight of the fact that women, cisgender women, may not be the most likely to experience assault, but they experience the vast majority of assaults. We cannot lose sense of that, but we need to think about how intersecting forms of inequalities contribute to different kinds of assaults. And this brings us to another big point of the book, which is that assault isn't one thing. It's many different things. And that's why we need the kind of multisectoral approach that we and so many others have been calling for, but that multisectoral approach needs to recognize kind of profoundly the work that we need to do to build equity as part of our prevention strategies.
I think folks have learned a lot over the last year, but I think one of the biggest things is that need for equity and anti-oppression to be the foundation of sexual violence prevention. And what I really appreciate about Sexual Citizens is that that is the case throughout the book and throughout any suggestions for prevention too. So thank you, Seamus, for sharing all of that. We're gonna move into a Q&A portion soon, but that chat was so active. I kept seeing it flicker out of the corner of my eye. Ashley, can you let us know some of the responses that were coming up from our last question about alternatives to criminalization and punishment and their intersection with prevention?
Yeah, absolutely. There were lots of comments. So let's see. So I think Rebecca and Allison both kind of talked about how we really need to create communities of care where we can create social change, where there is accountability. Rebecca talked about, you know, this is where the prevention continuum comes into play. And for so long, we've really siloed prevention into primary, secondary, and tertiary strategies and approaches. And really, we need all three of those, right? We need them to work together. We need to be healing as we're preventing. And Allison, just to kind of underline your point, Tori, Allison says attending to intersectionality and how we understand violence and oppression. There were some comments about, I think it was Sean. Sean's comment made me think about, how do we expect people to change and heal and grow when we're not treating people humanely? And so that really, goes back to what are some alternatives? What can we imagine? And there were some examples in, maybe it's more we treat things, depending on the incident, some type of like remediation opportunity. What could that look like? There were some questions around restorative justice and how survivors would really have to, participate in that, and what does that mean? And so then I saw some conversation about we need to start these conversations in families, right? We need families to really take responsibility for the sexual citizens of the future. And I thought that was a really, important point. So those are some things that I saw coming up. Tori, of course, there's lots more, and I'll continue to check in there.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I also saw some people going back to the driving example too, of, if someone does something that is like a sexual misconduct or a sexual harassment versus a rape or a sexual assault, how can those be handled differently, similarly to how folks don't lose their licenses for certain behaviors, kind of thing. So, Ashley, we do have one more chat question for our audience, and it's just, what questions do you have? And I know that, those may come soon to folks. Folks may need a moment to think those out and type those out. So while you are thinking of that, we have a couple of final questions for Jennifer and Seamus. You've hinted at this a little bit before. I heard quite a few audiences come up before. I saw some little previews in the chat, but who did you want to reach in writing this work?
I mean, who did we not want to reach in writing this work? I would say that we have 4 principal audiences. First, you all gathered here, people in the prevention space. But you need allies, right? You all are working so hard. And one of our main takeaways is that we're not going to get to the world we want to live in if you all are the only ones doing the work. So we want to bring in more allies. So parents, for the way that the book pulls back the curtain on what it's like to be a college student on a residential campus, acknowledging that Columbia and Barnard is a very specific environment, but students across the country have told us that the book really resonates with their experiences. And we want parents to see that they can't be free riders and expect other people to raise other people's children, not to assault, but that every parent really has a responsibility to acknowledge and lift up their own child's sexual citizenship, which includes teaching them to respect other people's sexual citizenship. Like so many things you do as a parent, from when your child is tiny, right? Don't grab, use your words. This is how you cross the street safely. This is how you take care of your teeth. Like, it is literally our job to teach them to take care of their bodies and not hurt other people's bodies. It's just that so many parents don't get all the way there when talking about sex. So they really lean into the oral hygiene. I mean, we're not anti-oral hygiene, but they just need to build on that and teach young people to take care of their whole bodies and to respect other people's bodies. So parents, young people, and it's been so meaningful since the book came out to speak with young people across the country and hear them sort of sidle up to us back when we would do things in person and say, "You told my story." But if there's a particular group of young people that I would say that we especially want to reach, it's white heterosexual men, because they do commit the majority of sexual assaults. And we want them to learn to see their power in a way that they can acknowledge that they hold that power without feeling accused of being bad people because of their social position. So, one analogy that we sometimes use, building on the driving, is that, if you're on the road and you drive a Hummer and there are other people around who are on motorcycles or scooters, like if you hit them, you're going to kill them, right? And it doesn't make you, I mean, maybe you're a bad person actually if you drive a Hummer, but like it doesn't make you a bad person to have a position of social advantage, but it does put you at risk of hurting other people. And so through the stories in the book, we hope that they can see the ways in which students hurt other people without meaning to, so that they can identify that themselves as possible assaulters in a way that typically people can't see themselves in the hunting ground narrative, because they're like, well, I'm not a sociopath, so I'm good there. So we wrote it very much for young people. And in our ideal world, young people and parents will read it together. Or, there may be some high schools that would pick it up as a second semester read for seniors. So also politicians. I think that's, our fourth key audience, because at the state level, there's so much inequality, and there's so much posturing by politicians, including, here in New York, our former governor, pretending to care about sexual assault, but not actually investing in prevention. And so we want politicians or people who vote for politicians to understand that there is so much more that elected officials could do in terms of investing in prevention, and that the first step in the Me Too policy agenda really needs to be ensuring access to age-appropriate comprehensive sex ed for every child in America.
Thank you for describing some of those key audiences. I know I had heard like parents coming up before, and I also really appreciate the primary prevention, the prevention of perpetration approach in talking about, why choose certain audiences that you hope this book reaches. We have one more question for you, and then I see a lot more coming in on the chat. But what surprised you in doing this research? Did you experience any challenges or difficulties while conducting this research with students?
So I think so many things surprised us. I'll probably just hit on one of them, and then maybe in the Q&A we can get to more, because I want to make sure we have time for the voices of the participants as well in this. Alcohol. We haven't talked too much about alcohol so far in the conversation, but I would say two things, because I'm on twos today, about alcohol and sex. One of the conclusions we came to, and this may seem really obvious, but it's important to recognize, is that young people don't just get drunk and then happen to have sex. They get drunk in order to have sex. Sex and substance use go together. And this isn't just a young people thing. It's actually a lot of people thing. It's not an everybody thing. And we thought that public health teaches us a lot here, that we can't just shame our way out of this or yell and scream that people need to act differently. We can't just assume that if we tell people don't be drunk and have sex, that's going to work, especially if they're getting drunk in order to have sex. So let me give you some evidence of this. One young woman, and this, of the many things that we heard, including the many stories of assault, this was like one of the most crushing things. One young woman said to us, getting drunk before having sex is like Novocaine before the dentist. It just numbs me for what I'm about to do. And that was crushing, for really obvious reasons. But what it reflected was a context where she grew up in and was raised in, where sex was a shameful thing. It was something that she needed to get inebriated in order to do, because it was understood as something dirty or immoral. Young people had gotten the lesson that sex was a nasty, dirty, rotten thing that they should only do to somebody that they love after they're married. And like, we are not setting them up well. And so when thinking about alcohol and sex, the first thing is to think about how our systems of sexual shame are actually doing a lot to produce why it is that alcohol and sex are intertwined in the way that they are, and producing risk both for people committing assaults and for experiencing assaults. The second point is that first part. We often talk about alcohol and risk as the risk of being assaulted. But like, when we talk about why you shouldn't drunk drive, we don't say, don't drunk drive, because someone else on the road may slam into you and kill you. And if you're drunk, you may not react as quickly. Your reflexes are going to be slowed down. Like, that is not the lesson that we give people. What do we say? Don't drink and drive because you might hurt somebody. When you're drunk, you do not pick up on cues. You do not react as quickly. You act in ways that you wouldn't otherwise act. And so I think reframing the conversation is really important. The final thing I'll say, and this I'll just touch on and then move on, is that there's a chapter in the book called The Toxic Campus Brew. And it's about the intersections of alcohol, whiteness, and masculinity. And it notes that white men drink significantly more than other groups on campus. And that interweaving of those three things of masculinity, whiteness, and alcohol is actually really under leveraged as something that we could begin to think about what public health approaches could do to address that particular population in terms of how it is that they're producing risk.
Again, with those driving metaphors, I'm just like absolutely mind blown at that. Thank you for sharing some insight about what surprised you about alcohol and coming up with that. I know that was something that really stuck with me that I had read too. And coming from my previous work in sexual violence prevention and sexual health education on a campus, thinking back to like, if only I had this book while I was there to change my approach to how I talk about alcohol and sexual violence or any of my sexual violence prevention work. So I'm really excited for folks here and today who are learning about this and able to do this work on their campuses. Ashley, there have been so many comments coming through from the chat. Can you bring some of those to the floor?
Yes, absolutely. And I've seen Jennifer responding to some of those, so thank you, Jennifer. So Becca wanted to know, what do we know about how these findings are paralleled outside of campus settings?
So I'll just jump in then. We don't know, like the research that we've done draws a lot on other findings and puts it in conversation with it. What Jennifer and I are hoping is that the three main concepts of the project can be used to analyze other settings. So what would it look like to apply, say, a sexual geographies framework to sexual harassment in the workplace? Well, what it would partially do is think about the intertwining of space and power within workplaces and how the use of space often augments rather than moderates power inequalities in workplaces. And by doing that, sets the groundwork for, or at least increases the likelihood of experiences of things like sexual harassment. Now, I want to be really clear. I am not making the claim that that's true. What I'm proposing is that this could be a form of analysis. Jennifer and I, we wrote the book for a general audience. It's written in a way that we wanted it to be accessible to a high school senior at any high school in America. But when it comes to making claims, we like to stay in our lane as scientists. But I will note that, like, Jennifer and I have both seen colleagues cry over their office because the office is not sufficiently large as to reflect their perceived status. And there's a way that space and control over space and power are deeply intertwined in our understandings of our lives and where we work. And so what I would say as a response to this question is, like, these are heuristics, frameworks, tools to think with, and then analyze different spaces. You know, the analysis that we do is of Columbia and Barnard, which is a residential college and university system in New York City. even if you're thinking about colleges and universities, half of the students in the country right now do not go to residential colleges. They go to commuter schools. And so some of the findings that we talk about, how seniors get better housing and how that funnels frequently freshmen into sexual spaces controlled by senior men, won't apply to the context of colleges and universities that aren't fully residential. But the concept of sexual geographies could be applied. And then what we're hoping communities will do is through that application, see when it's useful and what new insights they can provide through that application.
That's really helpful, Seamus. Thank you. I know that, when I read Sexual Citizens, I'm working at a coalition, and so I wasn't working on campus, but I really did kind of apply it to so many other different kinds of settings and communities, and it still made a lot of sense. So really appreciate that. Let's see, there's lots of questions about, how do we engage this group? How do we get these people on board? So I don't know if you have any just kind of like general tips of engaging, certain communities or certain sectors. There's lots of that. And so some examples are faith-based groups, folks who maybe are more conservative, campus staff and administrators. I don't know if you all have any tips for engaging people who maybe you have to bring a little bit further along to get on board.
I mean, I think most of the people with whom we could imagine collaborating are not in the pro-sexual assault group, right? So like, let's start from a position of generosity that like everybody would like to be part of the solution. I think about the connection we made with the vice president of housing and dining. He had never thought about this as part of his job. So, I guess we would self-servingly say like, start a campus book club and invite the senior administrators. But I think really like helping people who are outside of the sexual assault prevention space, and maybe like to start with an alliance. The most obvious partnership is with people doing DEI work on campus, right? And so then, and like every campus is at least saying they care about DEI. So like, give them an opportunity to show, like engage them in a conversation about space and racial inequality on campus. Or if that feels too politically third railish for your context, engage them in a conversation about how much they spend in insurance premiums because of sexual assault cases that need to be settled. So like, I think seeing, like taking it from a community organizer perspective, right? Like you have your story, they have their story. Tell your story, listen to their story, and find your space of mutual interest, right? Like everybody who works on campuses, for the most part, is committed to seeing students thrive. And so I think bringing in partners who can see that there's a special something that they could contribute to student thriving that they may never have thought about. In a way, it's potentially easier to bring in those people who haven't been doing sexual assault prevention work because they don't see the conversation as you telling them that they've been doing a bad job at their work. Instead, they see the conversation as like a new opportunity for them to be a rock star on campus, to like be part of solving this problem that has been intractable for decades. So I think it all begins, I guess, with having relationships with the people that you would like to work with, listening to them, and then finding an area of common ground to move ahead.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think that's really, really good advice and insight. And we talk a lot on Prevent Connect about how we have to tailor our messaging depending on who we're talking to. And so finding like, what do we have in common? What about this issue speaks to this person or this group of people? And then really like connecting the dots for them, shows them how they can be involved, how they can make a difference. So there was a question about developing sexual education context inclusive of people that are, coming from so many different cultural backgrounds. Specifically, how do we engage people who are brought up in a country or culture where their sexual citizenship was not really respected or even addressed in a different manner? And really thinking like, what if this college is the first time that people are getting any type of sex education? Do you have any thoughts about that? I know it's a big question. So
Yeah, I mean,
any insight you might have.
absolutely. I mean, it's not just a foreign students thing. It's also, students from some states where sex ed is radically underfunded, or from school districts that are underfunded and undersupported, not just for sex ed, but for all kinds of things. Any of us could, in our own communities, do an incredible job preparing our kids to enter into the world as sexual citizens with clarity about sexual projects. But we need to recognize that they're going to be having sex with other people, and that it's really insufficient for us to think about this on that individual level. Think about what's happening right now with COVID and the vaccine. Us individually getting vaccinated is insufficient. What we need is a community level, national level plan for everyone to get it, because even if we're vaccinated, we're still at risk because of that lack of a systematic response. And so the first thing I would say is it's really challenging to think about sex ed as part of a national agenda. It really has to happen because of federalism on a state by state basis. And this is someplace where we think communities have a little bit more power than they often imagine, that some flexing on this is really important. And Jennifer has done a ton of important work, and not just academic work, but activist work in advancing this. The other thing I'll say, and this is a little bit of a different answer to how do we meet people with very different levels or positionalities, is that many of you may be familiar with the T video, the video where they talk about consent in a very cute way, and it's charming and lovely. And yet Jennifer and I have kind of a fundamental critique of it, which is that often when we are now teaching people who are from very different positions, what we've chosen to do is represent them in ways that are really not interpretable, right? What is the T video but two stick figures? So those stick figures don't have a sexuality, and they don't have a gender identity, and they don't have a class or a race or anything like that. And this attempt at universalism is very valuable to try and be, say, queer inclusive, where there's queer erasure. But one of the challenges is that we don't have sex in degendered bodies. We don't have sex absent of our sexuality or our class position or our race. All of those things are actually brought to bear and essential to understanding that. And so part of what we would also encourage is that there are lots of things that are part of prevention that aren't just about sex, that are about education in power and equity. And Jennifer pointed to this earlier when she talked about trying to reach cis hetero white men, because instead of sending the message you are hegemonic masculinity and toxic because of it, what would a positive lesson be that they could actually take and apply to their lives in ways that may be helpful? And so instead of providing a kind of broadest possible education that removes power from the discussion in an attempt to be inclusive, what would it look like to locate our discussions in a different way?
This is such a great conversation, and I love ending with having that power-focused, power-centered approach to sex ed and sexual violence prevention. I think that brings it back to how Ashley had started us off in talking about, in order to prevent violence, we need to address the root causes. So I super appreciate having you both here. We know that there were questions in the chat we didn't quite get to, but I imagine that the book gets to that. And we also have some other resources to share with you all as we close out here in the next minute. This was answered earlier. Again, great acronym, the SPACE Toolkit. So we will repaste that link in the chat for everyone to explore again. And Jennifer and Seamus also provided some resources and examples of other folks who are doing curriculum or toolkits or exercises around sexual citizens. So this is one of them. The Ethics of Sexual Citizenship has a curriculum. And then Stanford has a sexual projects quiz. So we're pasting a link to that in the chat as well. But that will conclude our web conference for today. Jennifer, Seamus, huge thank you, so much gratitude to you both for being here and sharing your book, sharing your wisdom. This has been a great conversation. I want to thank my colleague and co-host, Ashley Klein Jimenez, our captioners, and finally, a big thank you to our audience today. It was so great to see all of your inputs in the text chat, see your names on the participant list. So we thank you all so much. This concludes today's web conference. Take care, everyone.